All right.
Welcome everyone to Contemporary Issues. Thanks for coming out today. It's another big group we have. We're gonna have to maybe get a bigger room eventually, which is a good problem to have. So thank you all for coming and thank you Zoomers for being here. And Ron is going to talk today about majorities and minorities and our laws and how each of them are represented in America. So it should be a good conversation. And our usual announcements, Zoomers, thank you. Susan, can you hear me okay? Just checking. Okay, thank you. Please mute yourself when you're not speaking, and we are recording this for future playback. And any quick things in the news? Have we been watching the Olympics on TV? Yes, Jim.
I just loved Barb's sermon this morning, and I have been struggling with the rightness and the wrongness of the immigration problems, especially the southern border.
Yeah.
And her take on this thing as being a religious issue gives me a lot more to think about.
Good. Yeah.
Thinking about this issue as more than just economics and
Political.
all the other political problems that are going on. To think of this thing in religious terms puts a new face on it for me anyway.
Yes, the sermon this morning. Thank you, Jim. Okay. Okay, with that, we'll turn it over to Ron.
Okay, let's bring up our first slide.
Okay.
Of course, these last weekend, this week are based on the book Tyranny of the Minority. I'll pass that around again. But on that opening slide, we've got the question. Whoops,
Sorry, hang on just a
We need to
second. I'm just gonna
shrink the,
get the share screen
Whoops.
here so our Zoomers can join us too. Okay, there we go.
there's some boys playing not old baseball, and somebody has asked them the question, how'd you do, guys? We lost 6-5. We had 6 runs, they had 5, but we lost. That's kind of an analogy to the Electoral College. You can win the popular vote, and to give some examples, Al Gore in 2000 won the popular vote by 500,000 votes and lost the Electoral College by about 5 votes. And then, of course, Hillary Clinton beat Trump in 2016 by 2 million votes and lost in the Electoral College. So,
Are you a
It's-
proponent of the popular vote?
yes, very much so.
Okay.
Okay, it just tears me up. In sports, we would be mad as bleep if somebody told us you beat them on the scoreboard 27-24, but that's not enough. They win, you know.
You want to explain the electoral college in 2 sentences or less?
Yeah, we get to it. We get to it. Okay, jumping back to last week, we wanted to touch on a horrid event that happened in the South. The 3 martyred civil rights workers, Mickey, Schwerner, Goodman, and the other gentleman there. They were, of course, murdered in central Mississippi near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And next slide.
Hey, could you
Buried-
give me a piece of, could you give me a scotch tape?
Okay.
Thank you for.
Somebody's not,
I'm muting them.
okay, okay. But these 3 civil rights workers were murdered in central Mississippi and buried in the dam. Does anyone remember that summer of '64 and the disappearance of the civil rights workers, their discovery a couple weeks later? And there, of course, is a marker where that happened. Next slide. There's the gory picture. Bodies found in earthen dam August 4th, 1964, after a tip. The farm was owned by Philadelphia, Mississippi, not Pennsylvania businessman Burridge, who said at a Klan meeting weeks before this happened, you can, essentially paraphrasing him, you can kill as many of them as you want. I've got plenty of room in this new dam building to dispose of the bodies. Quote, hell, I've got a dam that'll hold 100 of them. Next one. All right. Interestingly enough, and there's some debate, but in 1980, when Ronald Reagan was running to kick off his campaign, his very first campaign address was held in the Philadelphia, Mississippi area. What a despicable choice. I mean, there's this horrible murder. It's a Klan. I think the Klan actually had at least their state and maybe their national headquarters there. And what a place to pick for your campaign head off. But the essence of it was in 1976, the white evangelical Christians split their vote pretty evenly between Jimmy Carter, a born-again Christian, and Gerald Ford. But then there was the realization after the passing of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Bill, 64 and 65, that, as Johnson said it, and we saw on the slide last week, we've lost the South, we being the Democrats, for a generation. And that was, he predicted it would happen, and it has happened, and it's still going on. I think he should have paraphrased it, we've lost the South for a century or more. Okay,
Dixiecrats.
right,
So Reagan was appealing to the
right, yeah.
white
So
Christians.
clearly.
Dixie.
In the late 70s, led by Jerry Falwell and his moral majority, the great white switch began to the GOP. The South changed from a Democratic stronghold to almost pure Republican across the board. And the big reasons: opposition to gay rights, opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment. That's you ladies. Roe versus Wade decision, and Carter efforts to desegregate private Christian schools by denying them a tax deduction if they were segregated. So that started the great white switch. There, by the way, is the embarrassing picture of Jerry Falwell's son with his pants half unzipped that made the news here just in the last decade. Next slide. All right. There's a lot of books out right now coming out about Christian nationalism. And the lady that wrote this one, Elizabeth Newman, she was a former counterterrorism official. And in her book, she talks about what she has seen. She says, in her view, she was working for the Internal Security Department. And she said she feels one of the greatest threats to the country right now is coming from this combination of religious and political people who think it's God's manifest desire to make the United States a Christian dictatorship, if you want to call it that. All right, so it's a book worth reading. Next slide, yeah, theocracy. So the simple fact is the GOP has become the quote undisputed home for white Christians fearing cultural and demographic change. There's a tremendous fear in this country right now. People don't like change, and particularly they don't like change of the country moving toward multicultural, multiracial, multi-acceptance of LGBTQ. And interestingly enough, the Tea Party movement emerged in February 2009, barely a month after Barack Obama took office. I had some indications, particularly in Texas, they were really ticked off that a black man became president, and it was a major impetus in starting the Tea Party movement within the Republican Party. That second bullet, the Republican white Christian base became a solid majority of the party by 2014. So the Republican Party was not just a Bob Dole and John McCain party. It's merging, not merging, but quickly converging and becoming more and more dominated. I won't say totally controlled, but strongly dominated now by a Christian nationalism group. There's a picture of Jesus with his red hat. And
What that is.
there's a saying, Donald Trump's willingness to say and do things that other Republicans rejected as bigoted, racist, or cruel allowed him to corral the white grievance vote. And that's essentially a major part of the Trump undergirding, the white grievance vote, and a big part of it has come from the South. Next one. There's been a purge of the rhinos. For those who, rhinos are not something you see in zoos. Rhino is a term used. How many know what rhino means? Republican in name only. And there's been quite a purge in that party, both in the national structure. Trump has put, is it a niece or something, in charge of the RNC. And yeah, dissenters have been, I won't say entirely pushed out, but it's getting close to that. It's getting close to that. There's certainly no place for any kind of an independent voice like Liz Cheney or Adam Kinzinger. 2021 survey, 84% of Trump voters said they worry that discrimination against whites will increase in the next few years. And another survey, 56% of Republicans agreed with the statement, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast, we may have to use force to save it. So, all righty, next one. Adherence to democratic principles. 3 basic principles for a democracy. There's others, but these 3 are pretty important according to the authors of this book, at least. Accept results of fair elections. Sounds good to me. Reject the use of violence to gain or hold on to power. And we're hearing that more and more after the attempted assassination a few weeks. And 2 and 3, break ties with anti-democratic extremists. All right. If we look at the scorecard, it's scary. 224 of the 261 GOP congressional members expressed doubt about the legitimacy of the 2000 election. That's scary. And on January 6th, nearly 2/3 of the House GOP voted against certifying the results. Yeah, wow, democracy under threat. And of course, Trump incited the insurrection, promoted threats, and then the Charlottesville marchers were chanting, "We will not be replaced," carrying the tiki torches, and the Proud Boys and other such groups were encouraged. So,
Ron, do they mean the 2020 or 2000?
2000,
It says 2000. Do they mean 2020?
2020, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I fat fingered it like I do with my typing a lot. Next. Okay. Here is a 6 criteria for democracy grade. And I think some of you may have this as a handout. But this looks at
Was talking to.
a course called the Republican Accountability Project, and says you should ask yourself for any GOP candidate if they how they stood on these 6 criteria. And the book authors say if they don't have the right answers for these 6, you need to seriously think about where they stand. Okay, next one. The Voting Rights Act. Interestingly enough, the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and then amended all those other years, 70, 75, 82, 92, had tremendous amount of GOP support. In fact, most of the Voting Rights Act opposition on the original bill was from Southern Democrats. But now it's a different game. In fact, the Supreme Court in 2013 struck down Section 5 of the Voting Act. Robert said, this was needed back in the sixties and seventies, but those problems have gone away. We don't need, this anymore.
What is section 5?
Section 5 is, pre-clearance mechanism. It prevented, some states from passing laws that were voting restrictive in nature. Provision 5 put in a lot of rules that you can't have, take a test for things like literacy of the Constitution, and it put a lot of rules in, so you can't disqualify people from voting for these reasons.
That was taken out.
And that was struck down, and within hours of that strikeout by the Supreme Court in 2013, Texas announced that it would implement the nation's strictest voter ID law, disenfranchising more than 500,000 voters. And soon these other states followed with more restrictive voting rights in their state laws. Alabama, Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Virginia moved ahead with laws that would not have passed prior to the removal of that section 5. Okay, next. And of course, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed the Democratic House in December of 2019, but the Republican Senate refused to hold a vote or even allow a floor debate on this issue. It's kind of scary when you have a democracy and you pass something in the House and you can't even get it to the floor for a debate and vote in the other House. Next one. Okay, again, the minority rule. The author says two domains should always remain within the reach of the majority. The author makes this, the two authors continue to make this assessment. Those with more votes should always prevail against those with fewer votes to determine who holds office. My, what a radical concept. Those who win elections should be able to govern. Legislative majorities should be able to pass regular laws that do not violate civil liberties or undermine democratic processes. How many here are Calvin and Hobbes fans? Anybody? Okay. And there's Calvin's dad saying, the world isn't fair, Calvin. And he's saying, I know, but why isn't it ever unfair in my favor? Okay, next one. Okay. Here are some of the minority rules enablers, some things that enable a minority to rule. Laws requiring super majorities to pass are undemocratic. When we say super majorities, when you start saying you need 60%, most say that's not a super majority, but it's a significant majority. Super majority, when you start talking about getting over 2/3 or over 70%, it's pretty scary. A good example, we'll go back to the law in Colorado, where they passed a law requiring background checks for guns purchased at gun shows. Surveys showed in Colorado back there around 2000 that well over 70% of the populace said, yeah, there ought to be a background check before you can go to a gun show. But a bill to restrict guns and require a background check could not even get a vote on the floor in the Colorado legislature at that time. It's a different story now, 25 years later. But there's a case where the minority ended up controlling things. When that did go to a vote to the voters of Colorado, over 70% of Coloradans voted saying, yes, you should have a background check before you buy a gun at a gun show.
So it's the rules in like the Congress and state legislators, the rules they have set up for how they can advance bills is what does that. stops.
part of it, yeah, and
Stops the.
the filibuster, we'll mention that. The Senate in particular has some very archaic rules that allow a very, very small number of people to hold up legislation. The money to support Ukraine was held up by a tiny number of folks in the House, even though there was a heavy majority voting for it. There were a tiny minority was able to hold that up for months. All right. I'm a big fan of Batman, and the Constitution was designed centuries ago, and it can tie the hands of the present legislators. And it's sometimes called the dead hand. It's a constitution written in the late 1700s that now is what we call the dead hand ruling from the grave. The more difficult the Constitution is to change, the firmer the grip of the dead hand is. Jefferson wrote, "The dead should not govern the living." He was saying, you shouldn't have put stuff in the Constitution that is so locked in that it can't be changed. And we'll look a little later on the data showing how difficult it really is to change something.
Thomas Jefferson also looked at the histories of religious wars in Europe and advocated separation of church and state. And I hear people today now talking about mixing religion and politics. Which is bad.
Next slide. Noah Webster made this statement. It would be arrogance to assume that America's founders had all possible wisdom to foresee all possible circumstances and judge for future generations better than they. If constitutional barriers are too restrictive, we have the dead hand controlling us. And a pretty good example today, if you look at things like gun laws, air and space travel, internet, fracking, climate change, birth control, telecommunications. And if we look at the adequacy of our Constitution to handle those and handle them well, yeah, you can see where the authors simply say constitutions need to be adjusted as they move forward in time.
Living document.
A living document, exactly.
Doesn't that take 2/3 of the states voting to pass a constitutional change?
It's worse than that. It's 75%. We've got the numbers on the slide here.
Okay.
Let's jump ahead. We'll get to it, but yeah, we'll look at the numbers it takes to get a constitutional change. And it's staggering, the kind of super majorities that you need. It's almost, yeah, we'll wrap up there. The authors make the contention that people, not territories, deserve representation. Of course, the Constitution was totally missing anything on equal rights and full suffrage, particularly votes for women, votes for minorities, blacks, equal rights. It certainly required a Bill of Rights to be augmented to it. A little bit of history. Does anybody remember the 3/5 clause? Yeah, you counted slaves as 3/5 of a person. And this setup, of course, it was interesting. Some of the Southern representatives at that time said slaves are purely property. They're just like a plow or a mule. They're purely property. However, we want you to count them as 3/5 so we can get some voting power out of our. I mean, what else you gonna count? Lawnmowers, tractors, give them 1/5 of a vote or 2/5 of a vote. Yeah. But at any rate, the 3/5 clause allowed the South to count the slaves as 3/5 and gave them 25% more representation and the House of Representatives. Hamilton and Madison strongly opposed equal representation of the states. In other words, Hamilton and Madison strongly said Delaware, which even at that time was overpopulated or underpopulated relative to the big states by 5 to 7 times, shouldn't get 2 senators the same as Virginia or Massachusetts. And of course, today it's gone to extreme levels of absurdity with Wyoming and North Dakota getting 2 senators each, and California and Texas getting 2 as well. Okay, next one. So in your handout, here are what the authors consider the counter majoritarian institutions. The first one is a good one. The Bill of Rights was added to the Constitution in 1791 at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. And this was a good addition to the Constitution, which had drastically not covered the basic elements of the Bill of Rights. But here come some of the bad ones that allow the minority the tail to wag the dog. Supreme Court with lifetime appointments with authority to strike down unconstitutional laws passed by congressional majorities. Here's a big word, a bicameral Congress. That means 2 houses, a House and a Senate, that both must pass a piece of legislation before it can get through. A severely malapportioned Senate, and I've preached on this ad infinitum, and you're tired of hearing me, I'm sure. But the fact that you've got half the US population in 12 states. A filibuster rule, a supermajority rule, not in the Constitution, that allows a partisan minority to permanently block legislation in the majority. The Electoral College, privileging smaller states and allowing losers of the popular vote to win the presidency. And then, of course, here comes the numbers that you'd ask about, Steve. Whoops, back one. Number 7, extreme supermajority rules for constitutional change. You need a 2/3 vote in each house of Congress. So you got to get 2/3 in the House, 2/3 in the Senate, and 3/4 of the states.
Yeah.
Too hard to do.
Yeah, that's, most political people will say, forget it, it ain't gonna happen. Yeah.
Was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be.
All right.
Stability, we want
Yep.
stability.
Ron, was
Yeah.
this because they feared the tyranny of the masses?
Um, part so, but it was more, it gets back to slavery. The South was just absolutely terrified that the North that had a majority was gonna take away and,
So it was regional, not just fearing the mobs.
Yeah. right. Although there was fear of that, particularly as you've pointed out, in the 1780s, a far smaller percentage of America was educated. Particularly out in places, wild country like in Kentucky and stuff. Very few people that even had elementary school training. Look at Abe Lincoln, where he had to get his education. But there was fear of the uneducated masses, the mob,
Yeah.
getting swayed by a powerful, charismatic speaker. That could never happen. Okay, next one. I love Dion. Here's my story, sad but true. America's the only presidential democracy in the world in which the president is elected with an electoral college.
All
We're
the rest
unique.
of them are
Yeah,
majority vote, popular vote.
yep. America is one of few, there's that word again, bicameral legislatures with a severely malapportioned Senate and a legislative minority veto. America is the only democracy in the world with lifetime tenure for Supreme Court justices. By the way, 46 of the 50 states have Supreme Court term limits.
At their state Supreme
At the
Court.
state Supreme Court, 46 of 50.
I
So-
do struggle though with that word democracy, because I've always thought we were a constitutional republic.
Yeah, right.
So I struggle when I hear the word democracy in that language.
Yeah. So in essence, the author is making an argument for a more pure democracy.
Not,
Let's move from republic to
okay.
more to the democracy end.
So Ron, what will it take for Biden to change? You know, he said he's gonna try to change that limit on this.
Okay, quite frankly, it looks like a snowball in hell's chance. Put it bluntly.
But what would it take?
What would you say?
Like a constitutional amendment.
Yes,
No, not on
the
the
Supreme Court,
Supreme Court term limit.
well, that's a good one.
He's asked, he has stated that's one of his.
Yeah, I'll have to research that more. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah,
I have a question about why did they decide to have no term limits for the Supreme Court? When was that made and what was the reasoning behind it?
For all federal judges.
what, you mean the states?
No,
No,
that's
national.
or the national level,
Federal.
federal level.
We've got a slide that talks about, in those days, in fact, it might be the next one.
Maybe so they.
Supreme, slide 22, go down to slide 22 and we'll come back. There we go. This explains a little bit. When they set up the Supreme Court back in the late 1700s, they didn't expect the Supreme Court to really have as much power relative to the other two branches of government as it turned out to be. They kind of thought it was a tertiary kind of institution as part of this three-legged stool. But it's, of course, that's not what it turned out to be. Life expectancy in the 1780s. Lifetime appointment didn't usually go that long. Interestingly, and the tenure, how long people stayed in the court, the first 6 judges appointed by George Washington served only an average of 8 years. And the average is now 25 years for those who have left the bench since 1970. So they didn't realize it. Today, 4 of the 9 Supreme Court judges were confirmed by what we call a Senate minority, where the senators that voted them in had collected a far insignificant or far fewer votes than the branch of the Senate that didn't appoint them. Had majority rules prevailed in presidential and Senate elections, 3 and maybe 4 of the current conservative judges would not be on the Supreme Court. In other words, if we didn't have a Senate that was so badly out of whack, this may not have happened. And certainly the Electoral College, putting Bush to victory and Trump to victory, and the appointees they have made. Let's go back to slide 20 real quick.
Well, then they're delayed.
We mentioned the Senate filibuster. If you read, there's pretty good history on the filibuster, and it was hardly used in the early eras. In the 1850s, Southern senators led by John Calhoun began to use unlimited debate as a veto, but said still there were only 20 successful filibusters between 1806 and 1917, fewer than 2 a decade. So it was still there early, but it didn't happen. But then they changed the rule. Now there's what we call 40% veto power. To stop a filibuster in the Senate, you must get 60 votes. So 40% of the Senate can stop anything.
There's another rule about the filibuster that has changed its magnitude enormously. It used to be that the person doing the filibuster had to stand in the well and talk. And if they could not, if they fell over in a faint, that meant that they were done talking. And they would talk sometimes for 2 or 3 days or something like that, and somebody would stand in their shoes for a couple of hours while they went to the bathroom or got something to eat or something like that. But they changed that rule.
Yeah, in fact, the last bullet there says, today, the 40% video ability is easy to employ via email or a phone call. You don't have to stand up there and read comic books and Sears catalogs anymore. You
And
have,
what the impact of that, the impact is that the business of the Senate came to a halt while that was going on.
Yeah.
And that was the big thing, is that they had to withstand not only their own physical problem of speaking for that long, but all the pressure from the other senators that wanted to get their business done. And all the pressure from their constituents that said, wait a minute, nothing else is getting done here, we gotta get, but that was the pressure upon the person doing the filibuster. And that too has come to a stop. They can go ahead and do the business of the Senate, so there really is not any demand.
okay.
Always remember Jimmy Stewart doing that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Mr. Smith goes to Washington.
next
I
slide.
also told young Jimmy, we'll tell you how to vote. It's okay. Don't worry about learning about how to work in the Congress. We'll tell you how to vote.
It's a great movie, worth watching again. Okay, so there's just a cartoon showing the single vote elephant pulling the 200 men in a tug of war battle. Unequal thing, yeah. Okay, so we've done the Supreme Court. Let's go to 23, slide 23. This is one of your handouts. I'm going to mention the Electoral College. Electoral College, because each state gets it gets its proportional number of votes, but then it gets 2 bonus votes, which means Little Wyoming and North Dakota and Delaware get 2 bonuses, just like Texas and California and Florida do. And the effect of this, the small state advantage in the Bush-Gore election of 2000 added about 18 votes to George Bush's 5 electoral vote win. Of course, Gore won by 500,000. No. How many million? Yeah, 500,000 votes, 500,000. But he lost in the Electoral College, and the Electoral College tip caused by this rural bias was enough to put guarantee of victory for George Bush. Interestingly enough, more recently, in the 2020 election, Biden won the popular vote by 4.4%. A 3-point Biden victory in the popular vote would not have done it. Had Biden won by just, they figure, 3 points, Trump would have won the Electoral College as well, despite losing the popular vote. Looking back at the election of 2016, the data there, this shows 3 states that Trump won by very small margins. He had a margin of 11,000, 23,000, and 54,000 in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, whereas Hillary had a 1.7 million vote win in New York. But just by the way, we've split up the states in the electoral distribution, winner take all. Trump won the electoral votes of this 4-state conglomerate, 46 to 29, even though he got beat by 1.6 million votes in the popular vote. So it just demonstrates very clearly what the Electoral College can do. We have another, let's jump all the way down to slide 28. Keep going. 30, yeah. Even going back to the election of 2004, where George Bush won the popular vote, 62 million to 59 million. But had Ohio, which was won by Bush by a very small number of votes, flipped the other way, the election would have been flipped, despite Bush's 3 million popular vote win. If Ohio had flipped electorally, and it wouldn't have taken that many votes to do it, Kerry would have won. Okay, I'm talking too much. Let's back up though. Let's jump to, let's just scan a couple of them quickly here. One thing, cures for this, proportional representation, they have this in Europe. Countries divided into a series of large multi-member districts, and they apportion representatives according to the split of the vote. So this is called proportional voting. Back up to slide 25. All industrialized democracy of continental Europe have adopted some form of proportional representation to do this, so that if you win the state of California, you by a certain margin, you get a certain number of votes or representatives
So in
proportionally.
other words.
It's not winner take all.
Right, winner
Right.
doesn't take all.
Right. All right, slide 27.
So these are like you see countries, Italy and all these that have these multi-party governments.
Mhm.
So 20% is from one party, 40% is from another party, like Israel too. That's proportional representation.
Right, right. Okay. Let's jump to slide 27. There was actually a pretty good attempt. That's a picture there of Indiana Democratic Senator Birch Bayh from the 60s. And he actually worked through the House a proposal to abolish the Electoral College, and it won in the House 338 to 70. I mean, it looked like, wow, we got rid of the Electoral College, but they took it over to the Senate, and the Senate killed it. Quote from Alabama Senator James Allen: "The Electoral College is one of the few remaining political safeguards. Let's keep it." Bayh tried again in 71, 73. He kept being successful in the House, getting huge majorities in the House to get rid of the Electoral College, but the Senate, yeah, whacked it. Okay.
So if we get the Senate to swing it enough this time around, maybe we'll be able to do some changes. I mean, if the House,
But the Senate's the one,
if-
the Senate's the one that stands to lose. That's why they don't.
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
okay.
That's why it doesn't always get killed there.
Oh, I know.
Also, you would have to win the Senate to get through the filibuster. You'd have to get over 60 senators. And that's, yeah, it looks grim. Okay. Let's see which one. It's 28. What do we have? Direct vote for president. We covered that. Uphold the right to vote. As we mentioned in an earlier lesson, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Uruguay voting is obligatory. So these are some of the things we need to do. Broad reform. 29.
Just a second.
I think in Australia, you get fined
Yep,
if you don't.
Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. Here's the ensure. Okay, back up to the one with there, Gore Bush. Notice how close it was in the Electoral College, even though Gore won the popular vote by 500,000. Abolish the Electoral College, reform the Senate so the number of senators is more proportional to state population. elect multiple representatives from larger districts, proportional representation. That may even include putting in some at-large representatives into your state delegation to get a balance that's reflective of the vote that happened in your state. Next one, 31. Next one. Empowering governing majorities. There's Strom Thurmond at age 100, who was still in the Senate. She set the record. Talk about age. And finally, 32, our favorite movie. Denmark, Germany, Finland, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden, and others already have these features in place. The authors say it will be a long and difficult trek, but we ought to get going on it. For example, women's suffrage. To get women to get the right to vote, the movement actually started in the 1840s. And women had to fight all the way to 1920 to finally prevail. So the authors feel strongly that we need to get started on this difficult track and try to,
But it was nonviolent.
try to,
Nonviolent.
try to trip on it. Okay, I've talked more than I should, so let's get some questions from the peanut gallery here.
Where was John Roberts in 1983?
Okay, go back to that slide. I think it mentions him.
He championed.
Yeah, he championed judicial term limits in when working under Reagan.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
On the immediate, you're making a good case that the Harris team should really look at a candidate in one of those states where we have lost in the past, like Pennsylvania to Trump. And think in terms of someone like Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, 20 electoral votes, really. That's a major factor in picking the VP, would you say?
Oh, for sure.
absolutely. In fact, we're coming up on an election where it's going to be scary. We could get a big difference between the popular vote and the electoral college. It's definitely coming down to what happens in about 7 key states.
Ron, just building on my friend Gene's comment about Josh Shapiro. By coincidence, I was chatting with our Attorney General, Phil Weiser, the other day, about a month ago. And Phil Weiser told me that he feels Josh Shapiro is a superior candidate for senior office in the United States in some fashion, president, future, vice president, future, et cetera. Thank you for mentioning that, Gene.
Okay.
Phil Weiser is very high on Josh Shapiro.
Okay.
Did he say why?
In part, he told me because he thinks a lot like Phil Weiser. There you go.
Okay.
About Mark Kelly.
No, so anyway, I thought I'd just share
Okay.
that. Thanks, Gene, for your comment.
I like Mark Kelly.
The big political worry is, would the vice presidential selection be a strong enough influencer to change the voting in Pennsylvania or Arizona, for example, with Mark Kelly, enough to make the difference? But we could be in for a god awful shock come November 7th and 8th. We could get some really strange things happen.
Why was the electoral college developed instead of using the popular vote?
I think I wanted to speak, that's what I wanted
Yeah.
to speak to.
Yeah.
I think the counterpoint to your author's contention of this tyranny of the minority was the fear that those 13 states that you mentioned have all the population would then govern the other 37 states. That was her fear.
Yeah.
They would control the majority of other states, and the people in rural areas or Wyoming or North Dakota would not have any
And that the presidential candidates would only go to the big populated states.
Yeah.
They would never go visit Wyoming. And so that gave them a little more power, but
that's the
maybe
problem.
too much.
But there was fear of the masses.
Exactly.
The elites, if you want to call it that, the more educated people that were meeting there in Philadelphia, worried about the uneducated
Yeah.
masses picking the electors, and they felt like the state legislators with the more educated, refined Ben Franklins and whatever could do a better job of picking an elector set to represent their state. They were afraid of the
masses.
masses.
So is it so many thousands of people equal one electoral vote? Is that it, number wise, or how does that? How do they
How does they do
determine?
that?
Yeah, it's proportional,
Proportion.
It is?
yeah. But then the +2 cost them.
I would also like to add that I think another factor here is the extremely wealthy individuals in our country that have influence over the whole political process. For example, Elon Musk. So that's just another thing where there are people, and I know that AI has something to do with this as far as having these extremely wealthy individuals who then can influence our elections. Obvious.
Yeah, and now he's influencing the vote in rural Brazil, I just read.
Yeah.
By implementing the Starlink, he's giving voice to the conservative rural farmers in Brazil, because they'd have to climb a tree to get access to the internet.
Be the coconut tree, I think.
Jan, what did Jan have?
Jan.
Last week I did a little bit of research after your lesson and about the women's suffrage, and Denver had the second women's bank in the country, and it was only after Washington DC. And the women decided they were going to create their own bank. And so 100 women decided to, 100, maybe only 10, yeah, I don't remember how many women invested their own money. And they opened up a bank, and the first day there were lines all the way around the block to deposit money in the women's bank. And they had over $1 million in the very first day.
Yeah.
So that's the heritage of our women's bank within Denver.
And pride in our state. We're either number 1 or number 2 in terms of percentage of women in the Colorado state level legislature.
That's true too, yeah. Right.
That's great. Yeah.
We've got about 3 minutes left. I want to give our Zoomers a chance to comment if they'd like to jump in. Anybody want to argue for the Electoral College? Does everybody like the proportional voting? Yep. Hey, Zoomers, just want to give you a chance. Going once, going twice. That's okay. Frank Atwood, yes, sir.
Yes, I'd like to argue on behalf of the Electoral College,
Okay.
because my concern is that a state like California, their Secretary of State that decides what their population is. And if you manage to corrupt the census taking process of it, you can turn California into a pseudo super majority to inflict that onto the rest of the nation. I know that we have confidence that corruption would never exist in California. I think some of us have been told that Mayor Daley in Chicago
Careful now.
flipped Illinois for Kennedy. And I don't know about you, but do you really believe that Chicago and Illinois have been cleaned up? I mean, does anyone believe that? And I don't know. The argument for 3 parts of government is a balance of power, and how do you minimize the corruption? And I'm concerned that with a nationwide election, the corruption is that much easier to impose, more attractive. And instead of just having to corrupt 7 key states, you now have to only corrupt 1. So I do support the Electoral College.
Thank you.
Hillary won by 2 million votes. Popular votes. I challenge anyone to show me how she accumulated any significant number of illegal votes.
My response on Hillary is she couldn't count against Obama. She proved it. She couldn't count a second time against Trump. Obama won the Democrat National Convention vote against her in 8 years prior to her running against Trump.
Yeah, well, her as a person, yeah, I'm just talking
Right.
about the voting.
So
I think the election systems have been proven to be darn good. Yes, a few things here and there,
You and half of
But,
America
yeah.
agree.
it's it's, yeah, you're not gonna get whipped by three, well, this last election, Biden won by what, 7 million? Don't tell me there was anything close to that in terms of corrupted votes. So.
It's 11:30, we have to wrap up. Jim is next, and then the other Jim, and then we gotta go.
My question is, does anybody know what happened to the ERA? It did pass by the Senate and was ratified by 75% of the states, although the last ratification was very, very delayed. Last time I heard, they were talked that the delayed in the ratification by the states was thought to be too long, but there's nothing in the Constitution that said about time frame. So does anybody know what happened? Because it's out there in limbo.
I think it's hanging in limbo still, yeah.
So,
Equal rights amendment, okay.
Jane over.
Jim and Jane.
Well, she says she's gonna talk for me, so.
Okay.
I can't say
I'm
anything.
gonna have my turn.
Yes.
She always has her turn.
Listen, I've been out for 75 years, I get my chance to speak. Well, I'm with the women who started, as you said, in 1840 with women's suffrage, and it took them till 1924 to come through. Well, I think that's what we need to do. I hear so much of, well, it's not worth it, it'll take too long. Well, women can suffer through it, why can't men go ahead and do it?
Who would the class suggest as a running mate for Kamala?
What'd you say?
Running mate for
I say, does the class have a suggestion?
Oh, do we have a
Running mate.
suggestion on a running mate for Kamala?
Kelly.
Well, Shapiro had 20 electoral votes.
Lots of different ideas. Well, thank you, Jane. On that good note,
Yes.
we thank Ron for a good presentation.
Thank you, Ron. Bye.
We'll see you next week when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Bye.
You know what?
Yeah.